My name is Marshall Brady, and the most important phone call of my life arrived 3 minutes after I blew out the candles on my 70th birthday cake. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how close I came to losing everything. Not my money, not my house. Something much worse, my dignity. The strange part is that the day began exactly the way I always imagined my 70th birthday would begin, quietly. My wife, Grace, used to joke that I was the only man she knew who treated birthdays like ordinary Tuesdays. She had been gone for 4 years, but some habits remained. I woke before sunrise, made coffee in the same kitchen we had shared for decades, and sat alone at the breakfast table watching the morning light spread across the backyard. The house felt larger after Grace died. Not empty, just larger. Every room carried memories. The hallway where she used to leave Christmas decorations stacked too early, the living room where she spent entire evenings reading mystery novels, the cabinet in the dining room filled with photographs and keepsakes she refused to throw away. I had learned to live with the silence. Some days were easier than others. That morning wasn't difficult. It was my birthday. Nora planned to stop by later. My daughter had been busy recently, but I assumed that was normal. Life moves quickly when you're raising children and building careers. Around noon, I drove to my favorite diner and ate lunch alone. Several regular customers recognized me and wished me a happy birthday. One waitress brought me a free slice of pie. It was a simple day, a peaceful day, the kind of day that makes a man believe the worst parts of life are already behind him. At 6 o'clock that evening, I returned home carrying a small birthday cake I bought for myself. There is no shame in that. After 70 years, you learn that happiness doesn't always require a crowd. I placed the cake on the kitchen table, lit the candles, and spent a few moments looking at Grace's photograph beside the window. 70, I said quietly. Can you believe it? I smiled despite myself. Then I blew out the candles. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Clark Jensen. Clark had worked with me for nearly 20 years. Officially, he managed several property and estate matters after my retirement. Unofficially, he was one of the few people I trusted completely. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Clark never sounded nervous. Tonight he did. Marshall, where are you? There was no greeting, no birthday wishes, just urgency. At home, silence. Then a sharp exhale. Good. My stomach tightened. Clark, what's going on? Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. I need you to listen to me very closely. The fear in his tone immediately erased any remaining birthday cheer. I stood from the table. What happened? Clark hesitated. Don't go anywhere with Nora tonight. The words made no sense. What? And don't sign anything. My pulse quickened. Clark, I'm serious. He lowered his voice even further. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Don't meet anyone unless Roz is present. Roz Carter, my attorney. A woman I had trusted for nearly 15 years. By now, my heart was beating noticeably faster. You're frightening me. Good. The answer shocked me. Clark never spoke like that. Because you should be frightened. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then I heard papers moving on the other end of the line. Clark sounded as though he were standing somewhere he shouldn't be. Marshall, I need you to leave your house. What? Right now. Every instinct told me this wasn't a joke. Clark wasn't dramatic. He wasn't paranoid. He certainly wasn't the type of man who called a 70-year-old widower on his birthday and told him to run. Where am I supposed to go? Roz's office. The answer came instantly. Like it had already been planned. She's waiting. My stomach dropped. Waiting. That meant Roz already knew. Whatever this was had started before Clark called. I looked around the kitchen. The half-eaten cake, the birthday candles, Grace's photograph. Suddenly, none of it felt normal anymore. Clark, I said quietly, what aren't you telling me? There was a long silence. Then he answered with a sentence that changed everything. Someone is preparing paperwork that could take control of your life. And as I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the birthday cake I had bought for myself, I realized my 70th birthday wasn't ending. It was just beginning. I arrived at Roz Carter's office 23 minutes after Clark's phone call. The building was dark, except for a single light shining through a second-floor window. Roz was waiting exactly as Clark promised. She greeted me at the door, guided me into her conference room, and immediately began reviewing documents. I asked questions, lots of them. Neither Roz nor Clark seemed eager to answer. Instead, they focused on protecting assets, updating records, and moving several accounts into a trust structure that had apparently been prepared months earlier. By the time I finally returned home after midnight, I had more questions than answers. Sleep never came. I spent most of the night sitting in Grace's favorite chair, replaying every strange moment from the past year. The more I thought about it, the more certain memories refused to leave me alone. At the time, none of them seemed important. Now, they felt different. My daughter, Nora, had always been ambitious. Even as a child, she hated depending on other people. When she was 10 years old, she tried selling homemade bookmarks door to door. When she was 16, she worked 2 jobs during summer vacation because she wanted her own car. Grace used to admire that determination. "She's stubborn, just like you," she would tell me. Maybe she was right. Maybe that was why I ignored so many warning signs later. Nora's financial situation had become increasingly unstable over the last few years. It never happened all at once. It happened the way most problems happen, gradually. A missed opportunity here, a failed investment there, a business partnership that collapsed unexpectedly. Every time something went wrong, she assured me it was temporary. Every time, I believed her. Then Pierce entered the picture. The first time I met him, he seemed charming enough, well-dressed, confident, intelligent. He always knew the right thing to say. Grace would have seen through him immediately. She had an extraordinary talent for reading people. Unfortunately, Grace wasn't there anymore. I was. And I wanted my daughter to be happy. Looking back, that desire made me blind. Pierce loved talking about efficiency, optimization, strategic positioning, asset management. Every conversation somehow became a business presentation. At family dinners, he would analyze real estate markets. During holidays, he discussed wealth-building strategies. Even casual conversations eventually turned into lectures about maximizing value. At first, I found it amusing. Then I stopped paying attention altogether. That may have been my biggest mistake. About 8 months before my 70th birthday, Nora started asking unusual questions. Not directly. Never directly. She would casually ask about account structures, property ownership, estate planning, beneficiaries. I assumed she was thinking about her own future. Many people her age do. Then the questions became more specific. "Dad, have you updated your documents recently? Dad, what happens if someone becomes unable to manage their affairs? Dad, do you still handle everything yourself?" Harmless questions. Sensible questions. At least that's what I told myself. Around the same time, Clark began noticing small irregularities. A password reset request on one financial account. A request for account verification on another. Neither incident resulted in actual access. Both were quickly resolved. Still, Clark mentioned them during one of our routine meetings. "Probably nothing," he said. And because I trusted the world more than I should have, I agreed. Then came the email. I almost forgot about it entirely. An automated message informing me that someone had attempted to recover credentials connected to an old financial profile. The request failed. The system blocked it. I deleted the notification and moved on with my day. Now, sitting alone in Grace's chair after midnight, I remembered every detail. The timing, the questions, the requests, the emails. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. The following morning, Clark arrived at my house carrying several folders. He looked exhausted. Worse than exhausted. He looked angry. That frightened me more than anything. Clark wasn't an emotional man. He was methodical, careful, professional. If he looked angry, something serious had happened. He placed the folders on my dining room table without speaking. Then he removed a single document from the top of the stack. I watched his expression carefully. "Clark," I said quietly, "what did you find?" He stared at the paper for several seconds before answering, something that should never have existed. Then he slowly turned the document toward me. Across the top, in bold letters, was a phrase I had never seen before: Financial Guardianship Review. And for the first time since that phone call on my birthday, I realized this wasn't about money anymore. I stared at the words Financial Guardianship Review for several seconds without speaking. The document looked official, professional, the kind of paperwork people trust because it appears complicated enough to belong in a legal office. Clark sat across from me at the dining room table, watching my reaction carefully. "What exactly is this?" I finally asked. Clark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder and removed several additional pages. "That's what I've been trying to figure out." Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. Clark wasn't confused. He was disturbed. "There is a difference." He slid the next document toward me. At the top was the name of a physician I didn't recognize, Dr. Victor Knox. Beneath the name sat a series of observations regarding memory, cognitive function, and decision-making capacity. At first I assumed it had been sent to the wrong person. Then I saw my name. Marshall Brady. Date of birth. Address. Everything matched. My pulse immediately quickened. "I've never met this doctor." Clark nodded. "I know." I read further. The report described increasing forgetfulness, difficulty managing complex decisions, declining judgment, potential concerns regarding independent financial management. Every sentence felt more absurd than the one before it. "This is ridiculous." Clark nodded again. "I know that too." I continued reading. The report wasn't merely discussing aging. It was building a case. A carefully structured case. By the third page, the conclusion became obvious. The recommendations suggested additional review regarding long-term financial oversight. My hands tightened around the paperwork. Someone is trying to prove I can't manage my own affairs. Clark looked relieved that I finally understood. Exactly. The room became silent. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Clark opened another folder. That isn't the worst part. I didn't like the sound of that. He placed a second document beside the medical report. Durable financial power of attorney. My heartbeat instantly accelerated. Anyone who reaches 70 eventually encounters documents like these. They allow trusted individuals to manage financial matters if circumstances require assistance. The concept itself wasn't unusual. What mattered was the signature line. My signature. Or something that looked remarkably similar to it. I stared at the page. Then I stared harder. At first glance, it appeared authentic. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. The spacing, the pressure, the flow of the letters, close enough to fool strangers. Not close enough to fool me. I didn't sign this. Clark exhaled slowly. I know. The words landed heavily between us. Because if I hadn't signed it, someone else had. Suddenly the room felt smaller, colder, more dangerous. Clark continued sorting through documents. There's more. Another folder opened. Asset summaries, property inventories, banking relationships, insurance policies, retirement accounts, investment holdings. Someone had assembled a remarkably complete picture of my entire financial life. Not random information, organized information. Targeted information, information designed to transfer control. Who had access to all of this? I asked quietly. Clark hesitated. That's the question. He pointed toward several handwritten notes attached to the inventory. Certain items had been highlighted. My primary residence, several investment accounts, a collection of antique watches. Then I saw something that made my chest tighten. Grace's cabinet. The notation beside it read, "Donate or sell." For several seconds I couldn't speak. Grace's cabinet wasn't valuable. At least not financially. It contained family photographs, handwritten letters, old journals, holiday ornaments, and memories collected over 4 decades of marriage. No appraiser in the world would place significant monetary value on its contents, which meant whoever created the inventory didn't understand what mattered, or didn't care. Clark watched my expression carefully. That's when I knew this wasn't about helping you. I nodded slowly. Because he was right. Nobody protecting me would classify Grace's memories as clutter. Nobody acting out of love would prepare lists like this behind my back. Clark reached into the final folder. Yesterday, I followed a trail connected to the review documents. My eyes narrowed. And, for the first time all morning, genuine anger appeared in his face. I found Dr. Knox. The room became silent. What did he say? Clark laughed once, a bitter laugh. Nothing useful. He leaned back in his chair. But I learned enough. Apparently, Dr. Knox had participated in several similar evaluations connected to guardianship proceedings. Not illegal, not necessarily unethical, just convenient. Extremely convenient. Too convenient. Clark placed his phone on the table and opened a photograph. A parking lot. 2 men standing beside a black SUV. One of them was Dr. Knox. The other made my stomach drop. Pierce. I stared at the image without blinking. Neither man appeared aware they were being photographed. Both looked comfortable. Familiar. Like people accustomed to working together. Suddenly, every strange event from the past year began connecting itself. The questions, the financial reviews, the password resets, the medical report, the forged signature, the asset inventory. None of it was random. It was a plan. A coordinated plan. Then Clark looked directly at me and delivered the sentence I would never forget. Marshall, I think they're preparing to take control of your life before you even realize it's happening. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized my biggest mistake wasn't trusting Pierce. It was assuming he was working alone. For most of my life, I believed serious threats announced themselves clearly. You saw them coming. You prepared. You responded. What I learned over the next 48 hours was far more disturbing. The most dangerous threats often arrive disguised as concern. They use paperwork instead of weapons. Signatures instead of force. Family instead of strangers. After Clark showed me the photograph of Pierce standing beside Dr. Knox, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. The evidence had already answered that question. What mattered now was how much time remained before their plan moved from preparation to execution. Roz Carter arrived at my house less than an hour later. She carried 2 legal binders, a laptop, and the expression of someone already preparing for a fight. The moment she sat down at my dining room table, Clark handed her every document he had collected. She reviewed everything carefully. The guardianship review, the medical report, the forged power of attorney, the asset inventory, the photograph. For nearly 20 minutes, nobody spoke. Roz simply read, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking Clark a question. By the end, her expression had become noticeably darker. How bad is it? I finally asked. Roz closed the final folder. Bad enough that we moved today. There was no hesitation in her answer, no uncertainty. What exactly are they trying to do? She folded her hands together. Best case? I already disliked those words. They're preparing to convince a court that you require financial supervision. Clark nodded grimly. Roz continued. Worst case, they're preparing to obtain legal authority over major decisions before you realize what's happening. The room became silent. Even hearing it described aloud felt unreal. Nora would never agree to that, I said automatically. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Not because I no longer trusted my daughter. Because I no longer knew how much she understood. Roz looked at me carefully. Marshall, that's exactly what we're trying to determine. That distinction mattered. A great deal. Was Nora participating knowingly? Or was she following Pierce's lead without understanding the full picture? At that moment, I honestly didn't know. Roz opened her laptop. Fortunately, your trust documents were updated last year. I frowned. At Grace's request. Suddenly I remembered. A conversation from years earlier. Grace sitting in this exact dining room insisting that we simplify estate planning. At the time I viewed it as routine preparation. Now it felt almost prophetic. Roz smiled slightly. Your wife was smarter than both of us. That wasn't difficult. Grace usually was. Over the next several hours, we worked through a series of legal protections, account authority structures, property ownership confirmations, trust amendments, successor trustee, updates. Most of it was complicated, Some of it was tedious. All of it was necessary. Every signature I placed on those documents strengthened barriers Pierce didn't know existed. The strangest part was realizing how vulnerable I had been without understanding it. Not because I lacked resources, because I assumed family would never force me to need them. Around mid-afternoon, Clark received another call. The moment he looked at the screen, I knew something had changed. He stepped outside to answer. When he returned 10 minutes later, he looked even more concerned than before. "What happened?" Roz asked. Clark sat down slowly. "The movers have been scheduled." My stomach dropped. "Movers?" Clark nodded. "A residential transfer company." Nobody spoke. "Scheduled for tomorrow morning." The room suddenly felt colder. Roz's eyes narrowed immediately. "That's fast." Clark nodded again. "Too fast. Because movers don't appear out of nowhere. People hire them after plans have already been made, which meant somebody expected major changes very soon. "What kind of transfer?" I asked. Clark looked uncomfortable. "The work order references downsizing and relocation preparation." For several seconds, I couldn't process what I was hearing. Relocation, downsizing. Those weren't random words. They were the words people use when preparing an elderly person to leave their home. Roz closed her laptop slowly. "Then we were right." The certainty in her voice frightened me. "About what?" She looked directly at me. "This isn't preparation anymore." The room became silent. "It's execution." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Clark slid another document across the table, a copy of the mover authorization request. I stared at the page. Then, at the signature line. My pulse accelerated immediately. The handwriting looked familiar. Not because it was mine, because it belonged to someone else. Someone I loved. Someone I trusted. Someone whose name appeared clearly at the bottom of the page. Nora Brady. And as I stared at my daughter's signature authorizing strangers to enter my home, I realized the next 24 hours might determine whether I kept control of my life or lost it forever. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nora's signature at the bottom of the mover authorization form. Not a forgery, not a manipulated document. Her signature, my daughter. The same little girl who used to climb into my lap after thunderstorms because she believed fathers could protect people from anything. Sometime after midnight, I found myself standing in front of Grace's cabinet. The old oak cabinet occupied the same corner of the dining room it had occupied for nearly 20 years. Most people would have seen an ordinary piece of furniture. Grace never did. Inside were 43 years of our lives, family photographs, birthday cards, handwritten letters, school drawings from Nora's childhood, vacation souvenirs, Christmas ornaments collected one memory at a time. After Grace died, I couldn't bring myself to move any of it. Some things aren't furniture. Some things are anchors. Around 6:30 the next morning, Clark called. "They're early." The words instantly erased any lingering exhaustion. How early? Very. I was already putting on my coat before he finished speaking. 30 minutes later, I sat inside Clark's truck parked half a block from my house. Roz was there too. We watched in silence as a large moving truck backed slowly into my driveway. The company logo on the side meant nothing to me. The timing meant everything. 2 uniformed movers climbed out first, then a supervisor, then another truck arrived. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. This wasn't preparation. This wasn't planning. This was an operation already in progress. The front door opened. Nora stepped outside, carrying a clipboard. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I simply stared. Part of me still expected an explanation, a misunderstanding, something. Instead, she began speaking with the supervisor while pointing toward different sections of the house. The supervisor nodded and made notes. Clark looked away. He couldn't watch. I couldn't stop watching. Then another vehicle pulled into the driveway. Pierce, of course. He exited his SUV holding a coffee cup and wearing the same confident expression he always wore when discussing investments. From a distance, he looked relaxed, comfortable, like a man supervising a renovation project, not a man helping dismantle someone else's life. Roz lowered her voice. "Marshall, you don't have to stay here." I shook my head immediately. "Yes, I do. because if they were going to do this, I needed to see it. The movers entered the house. For nearly an hour, furniture began emerging piece by piece. End tables, lamps, boxes, dining chairs, personal belongings carefully wrapped in protective blankets. Everything looked orderly, professional, efficient. That somehow made it worse. Then I saw something that caused my hands to tighten around the edge of my seat. Grace's sewing table. The same table where she spent countless evenings repairing clothes, making gifts, and creating handmade blankets for Ava. Two movers carried it down the front steps as though it were nothing more than inventory. I felt my throat tighten. "This is insane," Clark muttered. But it wasn't over, not even close. Around 10 o'clock, another item appeared. Grace's cabinet. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 4 men surrounded it carefully. The cabinet itself wasn't particularly valuable. Old oak, slightly worn, easily replaceable. What mattered was what lived inside it. 43 years of memories. They rolled it toward the moving truck while Nora reviewed paperwork nearby. Then something happened that I will never forget. One mover asked a question, too far away for me to hear clearly. The supervisor answered loud enough that I could. "That one?" He glanced toward the cabinet. Client marked it low priority. Then he checked his paperwork. "Donate if storage fills up. Donate if storage fills up." The words hit me harder than any legal document ever could, because someone had looked at Grace's life and assigned it a category. Low priority. Disposable. Replaceable. Clark slammed his hand against the steering wheel. "That's enough." I understood the feeling, truly, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Then something even worse happened. One of the cabinet doors opened accidentally while the movers adjusted their grip. Several photographs slipped onto the driveway. Family pictures, old memories, pieces of Grace's life, scattered across the concrete. The movers didn't recognize them. How could they? To them, they were loose papers. One bent down to gather them. Pierce glanced over briefly before returning to his phone. Nora looked toward the driveway too. For one terrible moment, I waited to see what she would do. Whether she would run toward the photographs, whether she would protect them, whether she would remember. Instead, she simply turned back to the clipboard. That hurt more than anything Pierce had done. Because Pierce never loved Grace. Nora did. Or at least I thought she had. Finally, Roz placed a hand on my shoulder. "Marshall." Her voice was gentle. "You don't need to watch the rest." I kept staring at the house. My house. Grace's house. The home we built together. Then my phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't expected. Dr. Victor Knox. The room inside Clark's truck instantly fell silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. I stared at the screen while the phone continued ringing. And deep down, I knew whatever he wanted to say wasn't going to make this nightmare any better. The phone continued ringing. Dr. Victor Knox. For several seconds, nobody moved. Clark looked at the screen. Roz looked at me. I stared at the name flashing across my phone and wondered what kind of man voluntarily calls someone whose life he may have helped dismantle. Finally, I answered. "Marshall Brady." There was a brief pause. Then a voice responded. Calm, professional, controlled. "Mr. Brady, this is Dr. Knox. I believe there may have been a misunderstanding." The sentence immediately irritated me. Not because it was hostile, because it sounded rehearsed, like something prepared in advance. "A misunderstanding?" I asked. "Regarding certain documentation." Clark's eyes narrowed the moment he heard that. "Doctor," Knox continued, "I think it would be beneficial if we discussed matters privately." Privately. Another interesting choice of words. "No," I replied. Silence followed. Then Dr. Knox tried again. "Mr. Brady, there are details you may not fully understand." Then, "Explain them." Another pause. A longer one this time. Finally he exhaled. "Not over the phone." The call ended less than 2 minutes later. He never denied preparing the report. He never denied the guardianship review. He never denied the relationship with Pierce. When I lowered the phone, Clark immediately spoke. "He's scared." Roz nodded. "Agreed." I frowned. "Scared of what?" Roz looked directly at me. "Losing control of the narrative." For the next several hours, Clark worked nonstop. He contacted former associates, reviewed records, and followed every lead connected to Dr. Knox, Pierce, and the guardianship paperwork. Around 4 that afternoon, he arrived at Roz's office carrying another folder. This one looked thinner than the others, but judging by his expression, it contained something important. "What did you find?" I asked. Clark sat down and removed several printed emails. I found their timeline. My pulse quickened. Clark handed the first page to Roz, then another to me. Most of the messages contained routine business language, scheduling notes, logistics, planning discussions, nothing remarkable. Then I saw a phrase highlighted in yellow. "Birthday window." The room fell silent. "What does that mean?" I asked. Clark pointed toward a chain of messages exchanged between Pierce and an unidentified address. "I think your birthday was part of the plan." A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Clark continued. "Several references suggest they believed you'd be emotionally vulnerable around that date." Nobody spoke. "Recent age milestone." Another highlighted phrase. "Transition opportunity." Another. "Preferred signing period." The room felt colder with every sentence. They weren't preparing paperwork around my birthday by coincidence. They chose my birthday, deliberately. Because they assumed a 70-year-old widower reflecting on mortality would be easier to manipulate. Roz closed her eyes briefly. Even she seemed disturbed by the calculation involved. But Clark wasn't finished. "There's more." He reached for another document. This one contained financial records, corporate registrations, business filings. The heading at the top read, "Blue Harbor LLC." I frowned immediately. "I've never heard of that." "Neither had I," Clark replied. "Until yesterday." He slid the papers across the table. The company appeared relatively new, less than 2 years old, limited activity, minimal public presence. At first glance it looked insignificant. Then Clark pointed toward a transfer authorization connected to one of Pierce's accounts. "Follow the money." We did. Several payments flowed into Blue Harbor. Consulting fees, development expenses, travel reimbursements. Nothing unusual, individually. Together, however, they formed a pattern. Then Roz found something. A travel booking, Grand Cayman. My eyes narrowed. "Vacation?" Clark shook his head. "Not exactly." Additional records followed. Hotel reservations, corporate meeting expenses, future planning notes. Most disturbing of all, several projected financial models referenced post-transfer asset structures. I stared at the pages in disbelief. "Post-transfer?" Clark nodded. "That's what caught my attention too. Because one detail appeared again and again. Not Marshall Brady, not Brady Trust, Nora." The room became silent. Clark slowly leaned back in his chair. "At first I thought Pierce wanted access to your assets." Nobody spoke. "Now I think that's only part of it." He pointed toward another document. Nora's name appeared repeatedly in future ownership projections, joint account structures, beneficiary pathways, investment authority models, long-term asset control frameworks. My stomach tightened. "He's planning around Nora." Roz nodded grimly. "Which means Nora isn't the destination." Silence filled the room. Finally, Clark said the words neither of us wanted to hear. "Marshall, I don't think Pierce is trying to build a future with your daughter." He pointed toward Blue Harbor LLC, then toward the Cayman records, then toward the financial projections. "I think he's building an exit strategy." Nobody spoke, because suddenly the entire story looked different. This was never just about controlling an elderly man's assets. It was about positioning himself to control everything that came after. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I found myself wondering whether Nora was participating in the plan or being prepared as its next victim. For the first time since this nightmare began, I found myself hoping Nora had been deceived. Not because it would erase what had happened. Nothing could erase the moving trucks. Nothing could erase Grace's cabinet rolling toward a donation pile. But if Pierce had manipulated her, there was still a chance my daughter wasn't completely lost. Unfortunately, hope isn't evidence. Roz reminded me of that repeatedly. "We need facts," she said, "not assumptions." So that was exactly what we searched for. Facts. 2 days after Clark uncovered the Blue Harbor records, another piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. Her name was Bethany Cross. At first, the name meant nothing to me. It meant something to Roz. The moment she heard it, she sat forward in her chair. "Are you certain?" she asked Clark. Clark nodded. Completely. Bethany Cross had worked for a document preparation company that occasionally assisted legal offices, medical consultants, and financial planners. Not a glamorous job. Mostly administrative work. Filing. Verification. Processing records. The kind of position nobody notices until something goes wrong. According to Clark, Bethany requested a private meeting. Not by email, not through an attorney. In person. Which meant she was frightened. We met in a small conference room above one of Roz's satellite offices. Bethany arrived 10 minutes late and looked as though she hadn't slept in days. She was younger than I expected, early 30s, nervous, constantly checking the hallway outside. The moment she sat down, Roz closed the door. "Thank you for coming." Bethany nodded, but didn't smile. She looked directly at me. "Mr. Brady, I think you need to know what happened." Nobody interrupted. Bethany reached into her purse and removed several photocopies. The first page immediately caught Roz's attention. So did Clark's. Mine, too. It was one of the guardianship review drafts. Not the final version. An earlier version. One containing edits, notes, comments, suggestions. "Where did you get this?" Roz asked. Bethany swallowed hard. I processed it. The room became silent. Bethany continued. "At first, I didn't think anything was unusual." She looked down at the documents. Then the revisions started. Additional pages appeared. More edits. More comments. More requested changes. Certain phrases had been strengthened. Certain concerns amplified. Certain observations rewritten to sound more serious. The overall effect was obvious. Each revision made me appear less capable, less independent, less competent. My stomach tightened. "Who requested the changes?" Bethany hesitated. Then she answered. "Pierce." Nobody spoke. Not because we were surprised. Because hearing it confirmed was different. Bethany continued. "Most people involved only saw pieces of the process." Her voice shook slightly. "I saw all of it." Then she revealed something even worse. Several revisions had been rejected by medical reviewers before reappearing later with alternative wording. Technically compliant, ethically questionable, carefully engineered. Clark leaned forward. "Are you saying the outcome was predetermined?" Bethany looked directly at him. "I'm saying they kept editing until the paperwork supported the conclusion they wanted." The room became silent again. That sentence carried enormous weight, because it transformed suspicion into strategy. This wasn't concern. It wasn't caution. It was manufacturing evidence. Then Bethany reached into her purse one final time and removed a folded sheet of paper. "There's something else." Her hands trembled slightly. "I wasn't supposed to keep this." Roz unfolded the page carefully. An email. Printed weeks earlier. Bethany pointed toward one section. "Read that part." Roz did. Her expression immediately changed. Then she handed the page to me. The message came from Pierce. Most of it involved scheduling and document requests. One sentence, however, stood out. "If the review doesn't support guardianship, find another reviewer." The room became completely silent. Even Clark looked stunned. There it was, written in plain English. Not concern, not protection, not family care. Guardianship first, evidence second. Bethany lowered her eyes. That's when I knew something was wrong. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then my phone vibrated. Everyone looked down at the screen. The caller ID displayed a name none of us expected. Nora Brady. I stared at the phone while it continued ringing. Earlier in the week, she hadn't returned a single message. Now she was calling repeatedly, 3 times in less than an hour. As the screen illuminated once more, a voicemail notification appeared beneath her name. And for the first time since the moving trucks arrived, I wondered if my daughter had finally started asking the same questions we had. By the time I finally listened to Nora's voicemail, it was nearly midnight. Her voice sounded different, Not angry. Not defensive. Frightened. Truly frightened. "Dad, please call me." A long pause followed. "I think something's wrong." The message ended there. No explanation. No details. Just fear. For 2 days, I had imagined dozens of possibilities. None of them prepared me for what happened next. The following afternoon, Nora arrived at my house alone. No Pierce. No explanations prepared in advance. No carefully crafted arguments. She looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath her eyes. Shoulders tense. The confidence I had seen during the moving operation was completely gone. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, she looked around the living room and noticed something immediately. Grace's cabinet. Clark and Roz had recovered it before it left the storage facility. The cabinet stood exactly where it had always stood. Nora stared at it as though seeing it for the first time. I thought it was gone. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I said nothing. She slowly walked toward it. Her fingers brushed the wood. Then she opened one of the doors. Inside sat dozens of family photographs, letters, Christmas ornaments, school drawings. Memories. Her memories. For several seconds she simply stood there. Then tears began forming in her eyes. "Dad." I still didn't answer. Some truths need space to arrive on their own. Eventually she turned toward me. I didn't know. The words sounded sincere. The problem was that sincerity arrived too late. "You signed the authorization." Her face immediately tightened. "Pierce told me." She stopped herself, then looked down. "No." A painful laugh escaped her. "That's not true." The room remained silent. I didn't ask enough questions. That was closer to the truth. Before I could respond, Clark entered carrying a folder. Behind him came Roz. Neither seemed surprised to find Nora there. In fact, they looked as though they had been expecting this conversation. Roz placed several documents on the dining room table. "If we're doing this," she said calmly, "we should do it with facts." Nora nodded slowly. "Okay." Clark opened the first folder. "Blue Harbor LLC. Nora frowned immediately. "What's that?" "A company connected to Pierce." The color drained from her face. Clark turned several pages. Financial projections, ownership structures, future planning documents. Then he slid one page toward her. "Read the highlighted section." Nora did. Her expression changed instantly. Beneficiary transition models, asset migration pathways, long-term authority projections. Her name appeared repeatedly, not as a partner, not as a decision maker, as a mechanism. A bridge between assets and control. "What is this?" she whispered. Nobody answered immediately. Clark finally broke the silence. "We think Pierce was planning around you." Nora stared at the documents. "Around me?" Roz nodded. "Not with you." The distinction hit her hard. Then Clark revealed the next file. Grand Cayman. Travel records. Hotel reservations. Corporate expenses. Future meetings. Nora looked confused at first. Then she recognized something. One reservation carried a date. Her face went pale. "That's impossible." Clark raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She swallowed hard. "Because that's the same week he told me he was traveling for an investor conference in Chicago." Nobody spoke. Nora continued flipping pages. Another reservation, another itinerary, another expense report. The further she read, the worse her expression became. Finally, she found what shattered the remaining pieces. 2 airline tickets. One belonged to Pierce. The second belonged to a woman named Vanessa Reed. The room became completely silent. Nora stared at the page without moving. "Who is Vanessa?" I asked quietly. Nora laughed once, a broken laugh. "His executive assistant." Nobody spoke. We didn't need to. Her face already told us everything. Then the front door opened. Every head turned simultaneously. Pierce stepped inside. For a brief moment, he seemed surprised to see everyone gathered together. Then his expression hardened, especially when he noticed the documents spread across the table. "What's going on?" Nobody answered. Clark simply turned one page around so Pierce could see it. Blue Harbor LLC. The room became silent. Pierce's eyes narrowed immediately. Then he saw the Grand Cayman records. Then the airline reservations. Then Vanessa Reed's name. For the first time since I met him, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Nora slowly stood up from her chair. Tears were running down her face now. Not because she had finally discovered what Pierce was doing to me. Because she had finally discovered what Pierce was doing to her. Tell me I'm wrong. Her voice trembled. Pierce said nothing. Tell me none of this is true. The silence that followed felt louder than any argument, and in that moment my daughter finally realized she had never been standing beside the man she trusted. She had been standing in front of him the entire time, blocking his path to everything he wanted. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning. By 8:30, the courtroom was already filling with attorneys, clerks, and observers waiting for unrelated cases. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary legal proceeding. To me, it felt like the moment my entire life would either be restored or permanently altered. I sat beside Roz at the petitioner's table. Clark occupied the seat directly behind us. Across the room sat Pierce. For the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't smiling. His confidence remained, but the easy arrogance was gone. Beside him sat his attorney and doctor, Victor Knox. Nora entered several minutes later and took a seat alone. Not beside Pierce, not beside me. Alone. Somehow that hurt more than I expected. The clerk called the matter. The judge reviewed preliminary filings before turning toward the parties involved. What followed was surprisingly ordinary at first. Legal arguments, procedural discussions, documentation reviews. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Just facts. Which was exactly why Pierce's strategy began collapsing almost immediately. Roz started with the medical review, the same report that claimed I suffered cognitive decline severe enough to justify financial oversight. On paper, it looked persuasive. Professional language, clinical observations, structured conclusions. Then Roz asked a simple question. Dr. Knox, how many times did you personally meet Marshall Brady? The doctor adjusted his glasses. Once. Silence settled across the courtroom. Roz nodded. For how long? Another pause. Approximately 23 minutes. The judge looked up immediately. 23 minutes, not 23 sessions. Not months of observation. 23 minutes. Roz continued. And during those 23 minutes, did Mr. Brady demonstrate confusion regarding time, place, identity, finances, or decision-making? Dr. Knox hesitated. That hesitation lasted just long enough. Not directly. Roz allowed the answer to settle. Then she introduced the revision drafts. Bethany Cross was called shortly afterward. The moment she took the witness stand, I saw genuine concern appear on Pierce's face. Bethany testified calmly. Clearly, methodically. She explained how multiple revisions had been requested, how language had been strengthened repeatedly, how recommendations became increasingly aggressive, despite limited supporting evidence. Then Roz presented the email. If the review doesn't support guardianship, find another reviewer. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Pierce's attorney objected immediately. The judge reviewed the document personally. The objection was denied. Bethany identified the email, verified the source, confirmed the context. Suddenly what Pierce described as concern began looking much more like a predetermined outcome, searching for justification. Then came Clark. Of all the witnesses called that day, Clark may have been the most damaging. Not because he was emotional, because he wasn't. He presented timelines, password reset attempts, account verification requests, asset inventories, property records, mover authorizations. Everything was organized, everything documented, everything supported by evidence. Then he introduced Blue Harbor LLC. For the first time, Pierce visibly shifted in his seat. Clark calmly explained the financial links, the planning documents, the future asset projections, the ownership pathways built around Nora's anticipated inheritance. One piece alone might have been explained away. Together, they formed a pattern. A very troubling pattern. The judge listened carefully. So did everyone else in the room. Then Roz delivered the final blow. She called Nora. The courtroom became completely silent. Nora walked slowly to the witness stand. She looked exhausted, older somehow, as though the last few weeks had aged her years. After being sworn in, she sat quietly for several moments before speaking. Roz asked only a handful of questions. Did Nora authorize movers to enter her father's home? Yes. Did she believe the action was necessary? Yes. Did she now understand the information provided to her had been incomplete? Yes. The final question changed everything. Do you continue supporting the guardianship petition? Nora looked toward me, then toward Pierce, then back toward the judge. Tears filled her eyes. No. The courtroom remained silent. Nora swallowed hard. I withdraw my support completely. Pierce's attorney immediately objected. It didn't matter. The damage was done, because the petition depended heavily on the appearance of family concern. And now the family member at its center was publicly rejecting it. The judge called a brief recess. When proceedings resumed, the outcome felt inevitable. Not because Pierce had been proven guilty of a crime. That wasn't the purpose of the hearing. The purpose was determining whether I required guardianship oversight. By that point, the answer was obvious. The evidence supporting the petition had been weakened. The motivations behind it had been questioned. The credibility of key participants had been damaged. Most importantly, the supposed beneficiary of the process no longer supported it. The judge denied the guardianship request in its entirety. Just like that. Months of planning collapsed in a single sentence. But the hearing wasn't over. Before concluding, the judge made one additional observation. Several matters raised during testimony appeared serious enough to warrant further review by appropriate authorities. The statement wasn't dramatic. Judges rarely are. Yet everyone in the room understood what it meant. Investigations, questions, consequences. Pierce sat motionless. Dr. Knox stared at the table. Nora quietly cried. Clark closed his folder for the final time. As for me, I simply sat there breathing. Because for weeks, strangers had debated whether I could manage my own life. And now, at last, that life belonged to me again. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Nora approached me hesitantly. Her eyes were red. Her hands trembled. For several seconds, she couldn't seem to speak. Finally, she whispered the only question that mattered. Dad, can I come home? And standing there in the hallway outside the courtroom, I realized that winning the case had been the easy part. Dad, can I come home? For a moment, I simply looked at my daughter. The hallway outside the courtroom had become strangely quiet. Lawyers walked past. Clerks carried files. Conversations echoed from distant offices. Yet all I could hear was Nora's question. 4 weeks earlier, I would have answered immediately. 4 weeks earlier, I would have opened the door without hesitation. That version of me no longer existed. No, I said softly. The pain on Nora's face was immediate. So was the relief. Because for the first time in her life, I wasn't rescuing her from consequences. I wasn't protecting her from reality. I was treating her like an adult. Not yet. Tears filled her eyes again. I placed a hand on her shoulder. Coming home isn't the same thing as rebuilding trust. She nodded slowly. Deep down, she already knew that. Over the following months, several investigations moved forward. Pierce disappeared from Nora's life almost immediately. His business relationships began collapsing one after another. Dr. Knox faced professional scrutiny regarding his role in the guardianship process. Bethany Cross received formal protection as a cooperating witness. As for me, I finally returned to my home. Not the house, my home. Grace's cabinet remained exactly where it belonged. One evening, several weeks after the hearing, I opened it and found something I hadn't seen in years. A handwritten note from Grace tucked behind an old family photograph. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting hadn't. It contained only one sentence. Love them enough to help them grow, not enough to stop them from learning. I must have read that line 20 times. Maybe 30. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Grace had understood something I spent years avoiding. Love without boundaries becomes permission. Protection without accountability becomes weakness. A few months later, Nora asked if she could visit. Not move back in. Just visit. This time I said yes. The conversation was awkward at first. Healing usually is. But she came. Then she came again. And again. Not asking for money. Not asking for access. Not asking for forgiveness she hadn't earned. Just showing up. Slowly, trust began rebuilding, one honest conversation at a time. Around the same period, Clark and I launched the Grace Brady Care Fund. The program provided legal education, financial protection resources, and elder advocacy support for seniors facing exploitation and coercion. The idea came from everything we had survived. If our story could help someone else avoid the same nightmare, then perhaps some good could emerge from it after all. On the first anniversary of my 70th birthday, I stood beside Grace's cabinet, surrounded by friends, family, and people who genuinely cared about one another. Nora was there. Clark was there. Roz was there. For the first time, in a very long time, peace was there too. Looking around the room, I finally understood something. The greatest threat to a family isn't greed. It isn't money. It isn't inheritance. It's the moment people stop seeing each other as human beings and start seeing each other as opportunities. Pierce looked at my life and saw assets. Clark looked at my life and saw someone worth protecting. That difference changed everything. And if 70 years taught me anything, it's this. Love does not forge signatures. Care does not schedule movers behind your back. And family should never look at a father's life and see a liquidity event.